I thought the call was epic. Jonathan, I thought it was epic, transformational. Those are the sorts of adjectives that I use about this call. The president and President Trump and President Putin were in sync with one another. The call was outcome oriented. They were talking about how to save lives, how to stop the carnage, and for me, I was proud to be an American sitting there listening to it.
So, how did you find it, John? Let's get started with you.
Well, first of all, Mr. Witkoff's probably an expert on leveraging real estate purchases, but he didn't listen to the call in any other respect with any other expertise, and he's exaggerating. First, it's important to say that all of us are very hopeful that President Trump can reach the kinds of agreements that would end the war that Russia has been obliged to fight to secure itself. So hopefulness is there. The performance, however, by President Trump on that side, and I'll come back to the President Putin on the other side, was surprising in the following ways. First of all, Trump seemed to have been quite unprepared to hear the Russian positions, which have been repeated over and over and over again. In Trump language, who holds the cards? In that telephone call, Trump revealed he didn't have the cards. President Putin did. On the one hand, with respect to Kursk, where Trump has insisted on saving both the NATO forces and American forces that may be inside and the remaining Ukrainian forces, President Putin only offered surrender or die, which had been said before, but there was absolutely no movement in Trump's direction on that one. On the line of contact, there was no 30-day ceasefire. The agreement was that there should be a 30-day ceasefire of attacks on each other's energy infrastructure. But when Trump tried to describe later what that agreement was, a card player definitely has to remember the numbers on the cards. Trump couldn't remember. Trump's tweet, which came very unusually quite late after the talk, referred to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure. I'm reading from his words. That isn't what was agreed. It was a ceasefire on energy infrastructure, not energy and infrastructure. To get the words wrong in a tweet is indicative of Trump's carelessness. And if he claims to be holding all the cards, he couldn't remember that one. On the Black Sea, there was a discussion, but there was no agreement that the US and its allies would stop the kind of intelligence gathering over the Black Sea that targets Ukrainian attacks on Crimea along the contact line and on the hinterland. No agreement on the British operation to attack Russian naval vessels on the Black Sea. When Mr. Waltz got around to attempting to provide a readout on that, he misrepresented what had been agreed. So on the one hand, you have a reiteration by President Putin of the understanding that before you can have a ceasefire, the United States has to agree to stop supplying weapons and materiel and men to the front. President Putin explicitly referred to stopping the mobilization of Ukrainian manpower and women for the front. There was no agreement on those points, and no sign that Trump even was ready to answer on those points. If Mr. Witkoff was an advisor listening, his job as advisors, and both Ray and I have been in that sort of situation, is one of our jobs as advisors is to leave no surprise for the boss. Nothing should be surprising to him. We should have briefed him in detail on everything to expect especially on a telephone call as important as this one. But Trump was unprepared. The second major discovery I think I've made, and I'd like to hear what Ray has to say, is the behavior of the White House immediately after the telephone call. I've never seen a situation in which the Russian side beat out the US side on the public relations. Within minutes, RIA Novosti, the state news agency, had brought out and published a point-by-point summary of what had just been discussed and agreed. But the White House was incapable. It appeared to be that there was no coordination between the National Security Council and its advisor who managed this call, Mr. Waltz, the White House press office, the Trump tweet machine, and all the others. No coordination at all. There was a unique delay in Trump's ability to get something out on a tweet. It took him hours. Waltz's readout by tweet was incompetent. If I were in their situation, I would be very, very worried at this display of White House incompetence. What that reveals is something more serious, and this goes to the question of hopefulness for the future. The US has known this is coming. Both sides, the Russian side and the US side, agreed in Riyadh weeks ago to set up expert groups to do the detailed work that gets the agreements to the level where the presidents have to say, what are we differ here on? What can we agree on? Witkoff said he'd spent over the weekend 3 hours with President Putin and narrowed the differences. There are in fact no sign that Witkoff is capable of telling the truth or knowing what the differences are. There were no narrowing of differences. Rather, there was a display on the US side of a level of disorganization I've not seen before, which enabled the Russian side to capitalize, but still not trust what the US side is offering. And the trust was immediately broken by the significant Ukrainian drone attack on the Kazanskaya pumping station, another one of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium oil pumping stations in Krasnodar region.
John, it seems that as we talk, a Ukrainian F-16 of American origin was just shot down in the skies of over Sumy region. And it doesn't seem that the way that Donald Trump is trying to handle this situation would be that much influential as the Russian president or Russian officials were hoping that they're going to get it from the Trump administration. John, do you see this? Donald Trump was talking about 24 hours to put, then 100 days to put an end, but it seems that it's going to get 100 years to put an end to the conflict.
There may be a 100-year war between the West and Russia if you start in 1945. However, I entirely agree with Ray. The Russian side, Putin on down, and he does control his lower level experts, and they are more expert than those on the other side. The Russian position is to respect Trump, to give him the kind of grandstand he likes and needs especially, and to avoid any form of insult, any form of derogation, any form of cracking jokes at his expense. At the same time, what that means politically and tactically is to divide him from his underlings, from his subordinates, from those who can't follow orders. The shooting down, and I've also read it in the last couple of hours, the shooting down of the F-16 is the first, so there's a bounty which the Russian side has promised to pay the pilot or the field gunners who got it down. It's the first if it happened. When the bounty's paid, then I'll be sure. When I see the wreckage, I'll be sure. But more important is one other thing. It was a Russian Su-35 that shot it down. That's air combat for the first time, if I'm not mistaken, between a Sukhoi and an F-16, and the F-16 just lost, apparently on the basis of target data provided from an S-400 ground crew. Still, let's put it this way. We agree, Ray and I, that the top can resolve these problems if there's trust. The problem that we may also agree on is that Trump doesn't control too many levels downwards in his administration, and that the people he has, Waltz, Witkoff, Rubio, Ratcliffe, and Hegseth at Pentagon, aren't necessarily competent enough to deliver more than the kind of repetitive president of peace sloganeering that they think Trump needs. At the lower levels, the Russian side have to say, look at what's happening on the ground. I agree entirely with Ray. The Russian approach is not only to respect and reward Trump for what Trump needs to be rewarded for in public, but to divide not only Trump from his own staff who are disloyal or failing to implement the orders. Trump didn't ring up Starmer. Trump didn't ring up Macron. He didn't coordinate with the allies. It's a one-man, one-country show versus Russia. Whether Zelensky was taking orders when he launched the attack on Kazanskaya pumping stations, another matter. The Ukrainians claim that the Russians also violated the ceasefire on energy structure. This is a technical issue which can be resolved if there's trust, I agree. And if the top guy understands what's happening a couple of levels below him. What I go back to, however, is that the US promised to have the expert groups in place more than 3 weeks ago. There's no sign yet that the US side can agree between the agencies, between Pentagon, CIA, NSC, State Department, and what have you, on who should be there. And what's concerning to the Russian side is who would be in those expert groups, because many of them, Gorka, for example, under Waltz in the National Security Council, or Bono under Rubio at State Department, or Colby under Hegseth at Pentagon. These chaps want to fight Russia, want to go on fighting Russia. They're Russia war fighters still. Are they going to take, at the expert level, Trump's line, which Putin trusts from Trump? That's the issue. It's control down the line on the US side is not as it should be.
John, it seems that today Donald Trump talked with Zelensky, and right after that, the White House announced that the United States will continue sharing intelligence with Ukraine for defense purposes. Here is who you talk about the Ukrainian attack, their own attack on Russia, right after the talk between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. Who's Zelensky? Who's running the show in Ukraine? Is that Zelensky? Is that these people we're calling them ultra nationalists, or it seems that who have the upper hand in Ukraine, or is someone else in Europe that is trying to run the show?
Well, I'm not here as an expert on the Ukraine. And what I understand, first of all, is if you pay attention to what Zelensky said during the day, with the president of Finland, he said, we're ready to agree to the ceasefire on energy targets after the experts have met in the Middle East, meaning he's delaying his compliance, and he's creating a lot of ambiguity, which began with ambiguity, at least on Trump's side, with the ill-worded tweet. It's not ambiguous on the Russian side. It never is when the bomb lands on you. So Zelensky's ambiguous as you would expect him to be, and you've described a factional fight within the Ukraine that I am not expert enough to describe. I can't even think any longer of who's expert enough to describe what's actually happening inside Zelensky's administration. but it creates pressures on Zelensky for his survival. It creates pressures on him to be ambiguous. And yes, you're right. The British are those masters of deception, not boots on the ground, but lies in the air. The British have their own factional stakes in the succession to Zelensky. Arguably, the British support General Zaluzhny, the current Ukrainian ambassador to London, to succeed Zelensky or to be more influential in the outcome of the peace negotiation. I don't know who the CIA would favor for a succession and what kinds of candidates there might be. There's the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, who's not spoken of much as a candidate, at least in the Western press. It doesn't show to me that he's promoting himself or is being promoted in Washington as a successor. I think the US has had enough of Poroshenko. I think everybody's had enough of Poroshenko, former president, the failed president, the chocolate mogul, and the other Ukrainian candidates can be created as quickly as Zelensky was. So it's also unclear, if you look where the Ukrainian money is, what Ukrainian oligarchs are supported. We've just recently seen that Elon Musk attacked Ukrainian oligarchs who live in Monaco. In Monaco, he was referring to Viktor Pinchuk. Viktor Pinchuk is a significant Ukrainian oligarch who stole a great deal of money from an insurance company he had in Russia and spent some of that money bribing the Clinton family. It's arguably the reason for the hostility of the Trump side towards Pinchuk, that he was so close to the Clinton family and he funded Brookings institutions, Ukrainian professors and whatnot. Pinchuk remains a significant force, but he's always been a significant advocate in Kiev for Ukrainian adhesion to the European Union, to NATO. Who supports him, who doesn't support him, who supports Rinat Akhmetov, the electricity and mining oligarch, I don't know. And they aren't making too many statements to indicate which side of the succession, which side of the Atlantic they're on. So I think it would be futile for me to add anything there. A couple of things, and Ray and I agree with all that Ray's just said. A couple of things that may not be so familiar to the audience that are worth pointing out that President Putin has said. Before the telephone call in the meeting with Russian businessmen, President Putin was in no hurry to get to the call. He was very confident that day, and he looked fresh. He has looked tired recently. He wasn't at that session. In the private discussions with the businessmen, it's been reported in Moscow this morning that Putin said that Russia might make no claim on Odessa as a Russian city if the settlement went quickly. I don't know what exactly he said in Russian, but the offer was, we do this quickly at Vitkov speed, let's say, and I'll let Odessa dangle as a Ukrainian city. We've talked about this before. The reason is that the Odessans won't dangle for too long. They will go where the money is in the final analysis, and they may simply take themselves into Russia later, the weaker the regime is in Kiev. The second thing and that's a significant offer on the table for the US side to hurry up, form the expert groups, and agree on what Ray's just said, what we've said before, on a demilitarized zone that's enforceable and not by British boots on the ground, not by French boots on the ground, many of which are being killed at the moment. a demilitarized zone and a change of regime that doesn't have a fascist, Russia-hating, Slav-hating, Jew-hating, Pole-hating mental character, which they inherited from their grandfathers, and their grandfathers before their grandfathers too. What Putin also said was end the mobilization in the Ukraine. Now that's very significant because the mobilization is extremely unpopular, as it would be, is everywhere. During the Vietnam War, all Americans remember being unpleasantly upset about being drafted. Okay, everybody, no one likes to fight, especially with your chances of survival in the Ukraine. When President Putin tabled with Trump in the call an end to mobilization, that's a real challenge to the balance of power between the Zelensky civilians, the Budanov Secret Service men, and the British, let's say, on the one hand, and the military who want to stay alive and have a military to command later. We're hearing that Zelensky wants to fire Syrskyi, the current general, Zaluzhny's successor. What would really end, pardon me, the war for the army is the end of mobilization. Would be very popular, but it pits civilians against the military. And I'm not sure what part of the military command in the Ukraine wants a mobilization of women and children. And there was an attack on a women's unit on the front in the last 24 hours by the Russian side, and apparently with significant casualties. So an offer, you can keep Odessa, but you can't keep mobilization, is a very significant attempt on the Russian side to divide and rule the succession to Zelensky. And it should be understood that way.
Yeah.
John, Donald Trump, before talking with Vladimir Putin, said he's going to bring up this case of the nuclear power plant. Do we know if they talk about it and what Donald Trump wants from that case?
Good question, Nima. I've seen all the press reports. I especially since the telephone call, we're looking at Trump getting on a slightly small, not a grandstand, maybe a soapbox on the issue of whether the US could take over Ukrainian power plants. That is to say, the power plants that are still working, in order to safeguard them. On the one hand, Zaporizhia nuclear power plant is now within Russia. That's not going to be a US-controlled facility. Second, the US influence on the International Atomic Energy Agency as the inspectorate for nuclear safety is about as perverse and insidious and perfidious as the US influence over the protection of the world from chemical warfare. The destruction of OPCW by the US and the British following the Novichok case is a point that has to be raised. US control of power plants can be anti-Russian. So were the US to take over, as USAID was taking over, to repair the nuclear power plants that no longer operate at normal capacity in the west of the Ukraine, that might be something to be negotiated. But Zaporizhia cannot be negotiated as a US property on Russian territory. I doubt that. As a goodwill gesture to prevent the Ukrainians using their own artillery and rocket attacks on nuclear power plants to release nuclear radiation, that would be a good idea. That would be acceptable on the Russian side. Indeed, it would be a peacemaking idea to prevent the Ukrainians from developing dirty nuclear weapons, which the British Defense Secretary in a previous administration seemed to be endorsing. If the US wants to control that kind of Ukrainian military mentality, that would be a good idea. That would be a peacemaking offer too. obviously, the devil that is in the details of what was said. Would it mean, for example, that within a demilitarized zone, the US would take inspectorate responsibility for the safety of nuclear facilities within the demilitarized zone? That would be negotiable. I mean, Ray and I could work this stuff out. It's technical, but it requires first a boss who understands what's happening. Second, two bosses who trust each other, and third, a line of command and control, so that when the boss says something, other troops salute and do what they're told. All of these things are possible, yes. That they're on the table now after years of Ukrainian attacks on nuclear plants, as well as the attempt in Kursk to get at the Kursk nuclear plant. This is all positive.
Just shifting the gear to what has happened in the Middle East, Donald Trump attacking Yemenis. The same policy, this policy was in place since, I don't know, we can say a decade with Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain. They were fighting Yemenis, and the Biden administration has chosen to fight Yemenis, which didn't end well after all. Here is what Tulsi Gabbard said. When you compare Tulsi Gabbard before coming to power and right now, here is what she's talking about, Ray.
Yemeni people who are on the brink of death from famine, disease, lack of access to food and water, basic medicine and healthcare. Thousands of Yemeni civilians have died in this genocidal war being waged by Saudi Arabia with support from the United States.
It's absolutely outrageous that the United States has continued its support for years now for Saudi Arabia's genocidal war in Yemen that has killed thousands and thousands of innocent Yemeni people and caused mass starvation and suffering, a cholera epidemic, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world in Yemen.
Congress finally passed legislation to end U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's genocidal war in Yemen. Now this bill is sitting on President Trump's desk, awaiting his signature or veto. Now, he's already threatened to veto this bill, which just reveals how he cares more about what Saudi Arabia wants than what the American people want. You saw Trump's rhetoric on the campaign trail about Saudi Arabia, against Saudi Arabia, against United States support for Saudi Arabia, calling them out for what they are, and now refusing to end U.S. military support for this genocidal war in Yemen that Saudi Arabia is waging, that's created the worst humanitarian crisis of our generation, because he says, well, he doesn't want to risk a multi-billion-dollar arms deal with Saudi Arabia. So, you know, you can see, at least in that respect, what he's really motivated by. He would rather continue to support the senseless and devastating deaths of innocent people in Yemen and using our U.S. military, my brothers and sisters in the military, to do that, because he doesn't want to risk an arms deal with Saudi Arabia, a theocratic dictatorship that actually directly supports terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda. Trump's leadership, going back through his first term as president, he has been and remains very committed to combating and defeating the threat of Islamist terrorism that not only affects the United States, the American people, our own safety and security, but it is affecting so many people in different parts of the world. We can see different terrorist groups, the Houthis in Yemen being one of them, that President Trump has redesignated after President Biden took them off of the terrorist list, redesignated them appropriately as a terrorist organization, and taking action where the previous administration failed to.
Right.
The Houthis have been disrupting maritime trade and passage for a very long time, and no serious effort has been taken to stop that disruption. Our country and other countries should not be in a position to have to make a decision to reroute commerce going through that area simply because of the Houthi threat that exists. So President Trump has taken decisive action for our own safety, security, and prosperity. And I know we'll look to other affected countries, as there are many who are impacted by this, to similarly take action.
Well, I'll come back to Tulsi Gabbard in a minute, but let me talk to the Arab issues. I think a long time ago was another life ago. I was an advisor to the Secretary General of the Arab League when it was in Tunis. And I've written a book with my late wife called The Jackal's Wedding on the program of elimination, wiping out all the Arab national leaderships since 1943. The Yemenis remain the only ones left. And what President Trump and the Pentagon have done was what President Reagan attempted to do in 1986, assassinate with bombing raids from the air. What happened in 86, a policy of murdering Gaddafi and eliminating Libya as a national Arab leadership force, began with President Carter and Zbigniew Brzezinski. Those two hatched the plan to get rid of Gaddafi by murder. The Reagan administration picked it up, and in the end, they launched a bombing raid on Tripoli, which was intended to kill Gaddafi in the Babazia camp where he lived in Tripoli. It failed. It had U.S. spotters on the ground. Journalists U.S. journalists were used to spot that particular bombing raid. And I think that it's highly likely that some of the special ops intelligence assets that Gabbard controls, or can at least read now, were used on the ground to identify where the Ansar Allah or Houthi leadership were living. All I can gather is that the Pentagon briefer, General Grinkevich, who gave a briefing, an Air Force general gave a briefing, I'm looking at my paper to get the date right, March 18, indicated that human targeting was one of the objectives of these raids. And that's why residential areas were struck. It was an attempt on the US side to duplicate what the Israelis attempted against the Hezbollah leadership in Beirut. The Israelis were successful. They wiped out the Hezbollah leadership of the time. It appears the US has not been successful. I can't see, as I said many, many years ago, in another world, I had access to all sorts of Arab sources and plenty of ability to understand what was happening. All of that's gone. So I'm speaking from the dark and out of the past now. But essentially what the US is trying to do is to assassinate Ansar Allah, decapitate it like the Israelis did to Hezbollah, like the Israelis continue to do to Hamas. Why Yemen? Because it's the last of the Arab nationalist forces still fighting for the principles of Arab nationalism, which include the solidarity with the Palestinians, but it also is a self-defense. So I think this partly answers your question. It's not new. It's a continuation of a discreditable policy that has now, the Israelis have perfected it, a genocidal element. We will not only kill the leadership, we will kill all the people. That's relatively new, and that's, let's call that an Israeli invention. But the old idea of destroying secular Arab nationalism is not new. Trump has adopted it, and Gabbard is now defending it. The Gabbard's performance in India, where she was over the weekend, was another display of she again referred to Trump, the peacemaker, every 15 seconds or so, as Rubio and Waltz had done in Riyadh. It is, as Ray said, a display of loyalty to the boss, of a kind that you only see in countries run by personality cults. It's not the performance of the senior intelligence officer in the United States. It's the performance of a lackey in a personality cult. That Gabbard should use her office now to describe the Yemeni resistance as terrorist in order to justify murdering their leadership and all the collateral damage, is a moral disgrace for her. It's a discreditable display of Trump policy, where in the use of force to pursue a very old U.S. policy. Just to indicate what I read in this first Pentagon briefing of the Trump administration, and I see if I can find it on my screen. I'm having trouble remembering everything these days. No, I can't. Here we go. Sean Parnell, the new Pentagon spokesman, and General Grinkiewicz basically said it's moral for us to win. To win. He didn't say I would have thought the morality is we should win the moral end. No. Their idea, it's moral for us to win as quickly and as decisively as we can. This was said in defense of the Yemen attacks. The morality of destroying another country's leadership is a moral principle of the Pentagon in the Trump administration. That's what's going on. It's not new, it's discreditable. And from an Israeli-American point of view, it has succeeded. Only this time, the Yemenis have survived, one, and two, they have inflicted a level of damage on the Israeli economy and on the world economy, which is unprecedented for an Arab force since the beginning of the Arab states after World War II. Unprecedented capability to inflict long-term economic damage on the Israelis. And long war against Israel is the war that will destroy, from an Arab point of view, Israel. Long war is a war that the Israeli economy, the Israeli isolation, the smallness of Israel cannot survive, not even with US help.
John, here is what Donald Trump tweeted in 2019, October 2019. In his tweet, he says that the United States has spent $8 trillion fighting and policing in the Middle East. And he ends up with going into the Middle East is the worst decision ever made. And when you look at the situation right now and the way he's talking about maybe a new war, a new fight between the United States and Iran, do you see that happening? Do you see that coming with the attitude of the Trump administration?
Well, it's coming, all right, because it's being threatened. Second, I don't disagree with what Ray said, but in the Jackal's Wedding book, I tried to argue that a slightly different view about how the United States strategy has evolved in the Middle East. Yes, operationally, the Israel lobby attacks anyone like Daniel Davis or Charles Freeman, or many, and Ray will remember them, any CIA analyst that was spotted by the Israel lobby, which might have been occupying the desk next to this chap. Any CIA analyst who was seen to be too pro-Arab was removed or had their wife's job threatened. I mean, all of us who've been in that part of politics in Washington know how the Israel lobby works. On the other hand, it's been my view, and it's the story of the Jackal's Wedding, that it's also been US policy to subjugate all Arab national threats to what the US perceived to be its national interests in the Middle East. The story in Libya had to do with Wheelers Air Force Base and the nuclear targeting plans that Curtis LeMay had after the war aimed at the Soviet Union. The US view about how to partition and break up Syria back in the 40s, not so different from the way the US is behaving along with the Turks and the Israelis in Syria now. We could go country by country, and that's what the Jackal's Wedding book did. Israel is an actor that can manipulate the presidency and conduct purges all the way down the line in Washington. At the same time, there is been a fundamental strategic U.S. interest in controlling the Middle East, first for oil and now for much more. So to the extent that that policy has succeeded, to the extent that Israel has succeeded in wiping out Arab nationalism, and finally in the last few weeks destroyed Syria, now partitioned into a Turkish zone, an American zone, an Israeli zone. I didn't say Arab zone. Syria is no longer Arab. To the extent that all of these wars against the Arabs have succeeded is both a US policy and an Israeli policy. And Trump's tweet is as ignorant as it could possibly be. Therefore, what's left is Iran as a major power capable of attacking Israel and destroying Israel militarily, but will not. Iran is capable of supporting its proxy forces in Iraq and in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Gaza, and so forth. And it has supported the Houthis. Iran remains an obvious US and Israeli target. So I think I'm saying the obvious. The US side has said the obvious. The Israeli side said the obvious. Iran's the next target because it's the last target. The Houthis are small. They've inflicted extraordinary damage beyond their firepower. And they've done it very intelligently, and not because they're Iranian stooges. They're Arab nationalists.
Right.
But one has to say, they looked at the fate of Gaddafi, who was eventually murdered, as we all know, by a NATO force, the US having failed to kill him before. Gaddafi was small, but more powerful than the Houthis and Libya. Look where Libya is now. Look where Gaddafi is now. The Houthis are the last outpost of Arab nationalism that's sovereign on their territory, because the Palestinians are not sovereign in Gaza, subject to genocide, and they're not sovereign on the West Bank, subject to all the pressures underway. So the US side, like the Israeli side, will see the Houthis as a terrorist outcome of Iranian control. So Iran is the last target, but Iran's not Arab. It's the last target for a US policy that has used Israel, and Israel uses the United States. That's how I see it. It's two hands around the same throat.